Minnesota Department of Agriculture. During the first 6 months of 1987, Mark worked in Brussels, Belgium, with European farm organizations and agricultural policymakers to find solutions to the U.S. and European Community agricultural trade conflicts, which are surfacing in the current round of GATT negotiations. Since the late 1970s, Mark has been active to widen public awareness of the farm economic crisis. He was a founding member and is current board chair of the League of Rural Voters, a national nonpartisan organization of farmers and small-town residents devoted to increasing rural citizen participation in the political process. Mark has written numerous books and articles and has been the keynote speaker at conferences, seminars, and farm meetings throughout the United States, Asia, and Europe. His work in building international cooperation between farm organizations around the world was recognized when Mark was asked to give the keynote address at the World Food Assembly in Rome in November 1984. Please give a UAW welcome to Mark Ritchie.
I want to thank Russ and John for this opportunity to talk with you here this morning. But I want to preface it with a few remarks that dozens of people from around the country called me when I found out I was coming over to join with you here today to make sure I was going to do what I knew I needed to do, which was to give public and very warm credit to the United Auto Workers Union and to President Bieber for the role and participation and leadership that he and your union have given to the struggle of family farmers to protect their farms, their families, their way of life, and to protect the future of this country. I almost wanted to jump up when the question came earlier in the morning about, is UAW going to be helping and standing with the family farmers? President Bieber was absolutely correct in saying that he personally and the union have been critical in that movement, but I think he understated it. Yes, UAW members have been there with each sheriff sale and stopping those sales, but the influence, the contribution has been much deeper. Very few people in the UAW know that the original organizing magazine for the farmers in the early 1980s who were picking up the struggle, we named it AMMO after the UAW organizer magazine, which lots of us had grown up with. UAW members did all the training for the farmers and rural people who've been active in the elections in '82 and '84 and '86 and '88. The UAW also has contributed, along with other parts of the labor movement, to a deep and very underlying value and principle that's instilled and really led and inspired the farm movement in the 1980s, and that's that slogan that maybe you don't use as much anymore, but we use it all the time, and that's the idea that family farmers have come to understand that an injury to one farmer is an injury to all farmers, that we're not competitors on the land with each other. We're all involved in a system. We may be in a giant struggle, global struggle, with agribusiness corporations and other people, but farmers have learned, and I think the labor movement has shown the way, that standing together is the solution for the future, that an injury to one is an injury to all. I'm here this morning to talk about the changing environment and the implications for food production. And I want to focus that in two areas at first. The changing environment that's coming about because of agricultural practices themselves. And I'll go into this more, but you know the list, the use of pesticides and fertilizers and lots of other things. But secondarily, the broader environmental implications of the depletion of the ozone, the problem of acid rain, global warming, etc. But I want to turn to the environmental policy making arena, the national and international centers where policy in these matters are being made, where if we want to reverse this tide, we have to change some laws, some treaties, some approaches, and if we want to make things better, we have to make those changes as well. I grew up in Iowa near a small town of Newton. Some of you may be from near there, but Newton is the home of Maytag Corporation, which the UAW organized over 50 years ago. It's very unusual in that circumstance. And in the 1980s, that small town has fared much, much better than a lot of the rest of rural Iowa and rural America because UAW established a pattern of good jobs and good wages and good benefits. But much of the rest of rural America has not had that kind of a background, that kind of a tradition, that kind of an opportunity. And I think you've all been aware through the media and movies and the newspapers of the economic crisis that faced much of rural America throughout that period. But I think the links of that crisis to the environmental crisis, which we now see, which we're now much more aware of than perhaps ever before, I think have not been so clearly explained, so clearly described or understood. And I think this is crucial if we're going to solve the problems. I want to go back a little bit into history and to just give you a little bit of flavor that this isn't new. We may be talking about it again, but it's not so new necessarily, this link between the economic policies, the economic crisis, and the environment. My mother's a teacher in elementary school in Newton, and one day she was throwing out a lot of old boxes, and she found a little booklet published in 1927, Quaker Oats Company, called Grain Through the Ages. It's a little history book where they looked back over thousands of years and talked about the evolution of agriculture. And I want to read just a brief section describing agriculture in the early Roman Empire, around the time of the birth of Christ. It says, one reason for the decline of grain farming in Italy was the importation of grain into Rome from the rich grain lands of Sicily and Egypt. In Sicily, these lands had been expropriated by rich men and scheming politicians who farmed these lands with slave labor or very cheap labor. As a result, the markets of Rome were flooded with cheap grain. Grain became so cheap that the farmers who still owned small pieces of land could not get enough money for their grain to support their families or to pay their taxes. They were forced to turn over their farms to the rich landowners, and these wealthy men used the land for great estates for sheep ranges and cattle pastures. On the land of Italy, slave gangs working under overseers took the place of the old Roman farmers, the backbone of the nation. The farmers, after their land had been lost, were forced into the city, leaving behind the plow. They worked only now and then at a small wage. They ate mostly bread made of wheat, which was given to them by politicians who wanted their votes at election time. They lived in great lodging houses 3 or 4 stories high. And the land itself became very poor. There were no great rivers in Italy, as in Egypt, to spread new and fertile soil. And the use of slaves meant that the land was badly worked, because usually slaves did as little as possible unless they were under the direct eyes of their overseers. This brief description from thousands of years ago, I think, summarizes both the crisis we've faced in rural America in the 1980s and the link to the environment that this has created. Family farms in the United States themselves face low prices, not just because of imports, but partially, but also because government policy, which sets the price of agricultural commodities, was consciously changed to set the price below the cost of production. Farmers borrowed money to try to survive, and when they could no longer pay their debts, they lost their land. Impossible to hang on to their farms. They were driven into the cities, and lots of you face this problem. An influx of fairly highly skilled workers coming in from the countryside, creating competition in the market, driving down wages, making it more difficult to organize or to keep organized labor in the position it should be in. Thrown off their land, they were displaced into the cities, easily manipulated for people who were looking for scapegoats for their situation. And finally, our land has become poor as well, just as it was in Roman times. Farmers trying to hang on to their farms intensified their methods of production, using more chemical and fertilizer, trying to produce more crops, because as the prices fell, they had to produce more to try to sell more to keep their wages paid. It's as if your wages were cut into half, But of course your landlord wouldn't cut your rent in half, or the bank wouldn't cut your mortgage in half. You'd have to work twice as much to try to keep up the same cash flow. For farmers working twice as much, yes, it means twice as many hours, but it means twice as much often chemicals and fertilizer, which are terribly destructive to the soil and to the water that we all depend on. But even with that intensification, farmers couldn't hang on. Many lost their land to insurance companies, banks, to foreign buyers. There's a very famous case of the most premier conservation farmer in Minnesota, James Howe, down in our southeastern corner. Lost his farm after 25 years of struggle to hang on to it. Lost it to John Hancock Insurance Company. The first day that farm was taken over by the manager hired by the insurance company, gigantic caterpillars showed up to rip down the terraces and the fences and everything that had been carefully and painstakingly constructed to protect that soil and water over 25 years. Unfortunately for John Hancock, there was a group of pastors there and trade union members observing this. It was filmed and put on television. It exposed exactly the kind of lack of stewardship, lack of ethics or values that we can see when gigantic insurance companies, corporations, banks take over our farmland and put family farmers out of business. Excuse me. But this dynamic, the link between the economic crisis and the environmental crisis, isn't something that's just occurring in our own country. The same dynamic has occurred in lots of other ways in lots of other places. It happens that the United States, as the world's largest exporter of many grains, has a very dominant impact in the global situation as well. And I'll just give you one example. The United States sets its internal prices for agricultural products every 4 or 5 years in a bill called the Farm Bill. Because we are the dominant exporter, we set the world prices at the same time. If you want to sell wheat or soybeans or corn or rice in the world market, you've got to match the U.S. price or you don't sell product. The United States law in 1985, which the UAW in fact stood with the farmers and tried to stop, the Jesse Helms, who was the chair of the Agriculture Committee, and Ronald Reagan, who was the president at the time, but they were able to push through a new law which effectively lowered the price of rice from around 9 cents a pound to 3.5 cents a pound. And the stated purpose of this was to force other countries out of the world market, was to make Thailand, which is the other big exporter of rice, suffer so much pain and so much economic deprivation because of this that they would stop exporting rice. And therefore the U.S. could take over that market, and someday then the rice price would come back. Now it goes without saying we don't produce rice in this country for 4 cents a pound. It costs us 11, 12, 13 cents a pound. But the United States lowered that world price of rice, and it threw the Thai economy into a crisis. Half of their export earnings come from the sale of rice on the world market. Most of those earnings go to pay off their debts to British and U.S. banks. What happened in Thailand was that their earnings from rice exports fell in half as the price was cut in half. Their country went into a crisis. There were demonstrations outside of the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok against the United States 85 Farm Bill. They said they hadn't seen demonstrations against the U.S. like that since the Vietnam War. We, through our actions here, created a crisis for those farmers there in Thailand, and it resulted in very, very angry anti-U.S. demonstrations as a result. But Thailand couldn't just tell their bankers, well, forget it, the U.S. cut the price in half, we can only pay you half of what we owe you. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way with bankers at home. It doesn't work that way with bankers in New York. What did Thailand do? They were forced to open new, fragile, marginal lands to rice production, use more chemical and fertilizers. They didn't back out of the world market. They opened up environmentally sensitive land and used more chemical and fertilizer, increased their production, and then went into the world market, hopefully to sell, from their point of view, more rice so they could maintain their cash flow so they could pay their bills. But it doesn't stop there, because the United States and Thailand then got into a price war. You remember in the old days, gasoline price wars, where everyone tried to sell gas as cheap as possible to put somebody else out of business? The United States and Thailand engaged in that, and probably West Africa is the most graphic example of what happened. We got into a price war where we were willing to sell rice to countries like Cameroon and Nigeria and Senegal at $100 a ton below the local cost of production in those countries. Those countries had spent 20 years trying to build up their own farmers to be able to feed themselves so they weren't starving. So they didn't have to devote money from their nation to buy food from outside so they could feed themselves. In one very short period of time, we moved in with rice selling so cheap that local farmers there simply could not compete. They couldn't sell their rice in their own markets. They were forced out of business just as our farmers were here. This whole process where we disrupted the economy in Thailand and created environmental damage, especially in the highlands there, rolled over to an economic and a very severe hunger crisis in West Africa. Because in the end, when those countries use their scarce resources to buy food from the outside, they have no resources left to build up their own economies for future, to build up their own medical systems, their school systems, the things that it takes to improve themselves. And in the end, they are no longer in the stream of development that would allow them someday to be customers of ours for cars or computers or things that make sense to ship around the world. But this is just an element of how the environmental crisis becomes linked to the economic crisis here at home and overseas. But again, when we look at the environmental changes and the implications for food production, we certainly have to look beyond those environmental changes that are being created by farming and farming practices itself. The global changes with global warming, the ozone, those are now becoming more and more the topic and concern of people, and their implications for food production perhaps are much more far-reaching and much more important as we look down the river. President Bieber talked about the fact that we don't want to see palm trees up on Lake Michigan. And I think it's a very, very apt characterization. We get this sort of image from the media that global warming, well, it's going to be a little warmer further north. I mean, if you live in Minneapolis, sometimes that sounds pretty good, especially come February, March. People say, well, you know, that wouldn't be so bad, you know. But what they don't tell us is it's not a simple matter that the Corn Belt will move north to Minnesota and Canada and up towards the Arctic Circle. That's not the way the world is. The glaciers pushed all the topsoil down south, Iowa and southern Minnesota, Nebraska, Illinois. And that's the region with good rainfall and good moderate temperatures. If it becomes warmer further north and impossible to grow in those regions, you don't just plant corn in northern Minnesota because there's no topsoil there. Palm trees aren't going to grow on Lake Michigan because the granite won't allow the roots to go down as palm trees must. In other words, they haven't really started being honest with us yet about what might be the implications. There's only been one study, in fact, I think it was at Utah State. What would happen with a 1 or 2 degree rise in the temperature of the United States to our ability to produce corn, which is by far our greatest agricultural commodity produced in this country, the backbone of the cattle industry, the poultry industry, everything else. We could lose as much as 1/3 of our current land where we can now grow corn. We would lose as much as 1/3 of that capacity. Last summer we had a drought and we lost about 1/3 of our production, and we had a panic in terms of food shortage in this nation now. We had a pretty good year this year, and we're still at the lowest level of stocks in 30 years. So if we're talking about global warming reducing our land acreage by 1/3, we have no idea what that implication might be in the future because our population will continue to grow and many other things will happen. What about ozone destruction? Only a little bit of study has gone on in this area, but they do know that about a 20% depletion of ozone resulted in about a 20 to 25% depletion or reduction in some of our crop yields. Acid rain, we're already seeing the impacts of acid rain on reducing crop yields and also changing our ability to pump water. There are other concerns as well. As our aquifers are being drained through these gigantic irrigation systems in the western states, as we get down lower and lower and lower in those aquifers, we are concentrating the heavy metals, the nitrates and the poisons into less and less water, and so we're taking them into our bodies and into our livestock at a much higher concentration. In California now, we're seeing the carrying by the winds of heavy metal residues from the irrigated areas blowing from the Central Valley down to Los Angeles. We're beginning to see environmental implications that we've never considered before. What does it mean to have air with heavy metals impacting our crops, our livestock, our own lives? These are things in which we have not yet begun to look at the potential implications for food production, yields, etc. But we know they're going to be quite dramatic. But we also have to look at the ways in which we inside of agriculture, and I mean we in a kind of broad sense, how agriculture and agricultural policy has now begun to intersect with some of these more global concerns. Because we're beginning to recognize that as far as the environment goes, issues are either local or they're global. There isn't too many things in between. But on a global level, we've been very aware of the situation in terms of global warming and the relationship of that to our tropical rainforest. President Bieber brought it up this morning. But I think very few people understand all the elements of how these policies are linked together. In the 1985 Farm Bill, we didn't just lower the price of rice, we lowered the price of wheat, soybeans, corn. And Brazil and Argentina and certain Central American countries who had borrowed money to build their countries based on assuming a fair price in the world market for their commodities, suddenly found that the U.S. government had taken the rug out from underneath them, had cut the price of those commodities in half. What were they forced to do? They're forced to do what anyone would do, to try to expand, because they were no longer receiving the prices they had expected. Brazil in particular is an example of where they were forced to go further into the rainforest, to tear up rainforests a lot now for cattle exports. They began producing beef because it's what the World Bank advised as a way to pay their bills and their foreign debt. They began demanding that more of the U.S. market be opened up for the beef. And certainly anyone here thinking about Brazil and the terrible situation, one of your first reactions is, yes, we should buy more. But we don't think about the fact that bringing in that beef into the United States is the kind of thing that ruins our cattle producers, and in ruining our cattle producers, ruining the market for corn. And also the idea that we should somehow be encouraging the taking of food from a country where a third of the people are hungry. And I mean 60 million people in Brazil. And taking that food into the United States where our own farmers and our own producers can fulfill our needs, yet we're talking about taking food from other people so that they can pay their bills. When we push our cattle farmers out of business in the United States, it's not just another unemployed worker who maybe competes with a UAW worker someplace. It's a lot more than that. We raise cattle primarily in our region in the upper Midwest on very hilly soils and with very thin topsoils that are only appropriate for grazing cattle. But when you wipe out a cattle farmer, what do you get? You get a bunch of land with a lot of taxes left on it. People are forced to put on corn or soybeans or some other crop, which will work for a year, but when the good rains come, it washes that topsoil off of those hillsides into the Mississippi, down the river, and that land and that little tiny bit of topsoil is ruined forever. But as we see these environmental implications and their link to the economy come together in the agricultural sector and in the broader environmental sector, the place where they're coming together now in the public's mind is around the question of food safety. The residues on our food from pesticides, what's in our meat, what are the drugs that are being used. There's been a deep, very deep awakening in the American people about this issue. The notion that we must now put national attention and priority on protecting our environment for future generation and protecting our water and food supply for ourselves today have suddenly come together in a very powerful and new citizens movement. The National Toxic Campaign and other efforts that I know the UAW has been involved in, the rekindling of Earth Day and the whole notion that we need to expand it, the developments around organizing when ALAR and the use of ALAR on apples became such a national issue. We're really beginning to see the implications in the political arena. President Bush isn't calling himself or attempting to call himself the environmental president because that's what he believes. He knows that's what's good at votes. We recently had a proposal in Minneapolis to ban the use of styrofoam cups, and the plastics industry came out with full-page ads in television, radio, encouraging the citizens to call the city council to object to this kind of a ban because it would raise the price of food for poor people, and on and on and on. Well, people did call the city council, and 9 out of 10 called to say, pass this ban now. We must do something about the ozone. In fact, the city council said it was the most calls they've gotten on anything since the Vietnam War days. Now, that may be kind of a sad commentary on some of our other political work, but it says to me there's a citizens movement now that we've never seen before. I know in the Northwest now, the link to understand how jobs and the environment are put together is evolving very quickly. You know, we had this big fight over cutting down more of the virgin forest, the ancient forests, and the first issue raised was it would destroy the habitat for the spotted owl. So there was a big fight about what jobs would be lost and on and on. Well, it comes to find out that the reason there's a shortage of logs in the lumber mills isn't because of protecting environment for spotted owls. It's because raw logs are being cut and shipped to Japan and Taiwan, not being milled there. Well, the citizens have come to figure out that what they need to do is pass laws that say the logs have to be milled right here in the United States, and that's what they're doing. There was a referendum in Oregon. 91% of the people said the logs on the state land should be milled in the United States and should be blocked from being shipped raw overseas. I highlight this citizens movement in this positive new direction because I am very, very excited and thrilled to see, beginning to see some victories in this area. I'm especially thrilled at night when I come home and I'm with my daughter and my family and I think about her future and I think, well, by God, we're starting to do something now. But I have to tell you that every time we have a victory, it's a victory over someone on the basis of a struggle. And whoever that victory was over isn't just going to take their losses and go home or forget about it. There's been an enormous reaction to the victories of the environmental movement, to the farm movement, to the consumer movement, and we're going to see that reaction more and more. I noticed this last week that the United States and Japan teamed up together at this international conference to water down the resolution on global warming, to make it impossible for the international community to say in clear terms, we're going to do something about global warming. The United States and Japan stood together and said, no, we will not let this happen. The United States and Canada teamed up together on this trade agreement, this so-called free trade agreement. And I got to credit the UAW as being one of the only organized groups in the United States that even knew it was going on, and certainly one of the very few who spoke out and said anything about it. But what were some of the things that were done? I'll tell you one thing that was done. They put into that agreement that the Canadians had to lower their pesticide standards to ours, and they had much higher pesticide standards, but it's because there have been some victories in Canada on pesticides that the corporations wanted to get rid of. They made sure that there was a long-term access to cheap Canadian uranium for the United States, extending the life of the atomic power industry, as it's called, for many years in the United States by ensuring that. They also made sure that the United States had long-term, unlimited access to Canadian petroleum and natural gas resources. Now, I think President Bieber spoke this morning about some of the implications for all of you in terms of jobs and everything, because we've got this situation of cheap gas and cheap petroleum, and we sort of drag on this economy. Well, what the United States did in that agreement was to make sure that we could take Canadian resources forever without having to face any kind of environmental or other kind of regulations. In fact, the goal of lowering the borders between our country was so that they could take the lowest standards between the two nations and apply them together. But I think the most powerful reaction, the most powerful challenge to the victories that people have won are coming in the area of the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, negotiations going on in Geneva. The United States is making a number of proposals there that they hope will override and overrule and overturn the victories that people are having now. You know, in the old days, a treaty had to come back to the Senate for a 2/3 vote, could be amended like crazy. Well, under President Reagan, they changed that. A treaty now, they changed the word, they call it an agreement, U.S.-Canadian trade agreement. It comes back to both houses of Congress, but there can be no amendments. It's voted up or down with no change. They come in with a 2,000 or 3,000 page piece of legislation. They put in goodies over here for American Express and Chevron and whatever. It's impossible to stop, to block, to in some way defeat those proposals. And we learn that as a bitter lesson in the U.S. Canadian. They know that what comes out of those negotiations next November, we, the American people, are going to be stuck with. And they've decided to try to move everything possible and call it a trade issue so they can overrule the Congress. I'll give you a few examples. They're trying to argue now that laws which require goods to come in recyclable containers are trade distorting and therefore fall under the rules of trade. They're trying to argue that pesticide residues and chemical residues in food and agriculture products are trade distorting. And not only should they no longer be the right of a state legislature or Congress to make food, health, and safety law, but that those should be turned over to scientists from international agencies in Geneva, in Italy, and in Rome. They want to take the power of our Congress to setting agricultural policy or resource policy and put it in Geneva. Specifically on the logs, I was shocked. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. tabled its latest proposal on agriculture. They went to the trouble to specifically list wood and wood products, and they went to the trouble to specifically state that countries should no longer have the right to limit exports of their resources, even in times of critical shortage. Now, I assume that the logging companies and the environmental groups who've been working to try to find this sort of solution are paying attention and seeing it. But it's only to say that the fact that we've been winning victories here in the United States in the environmental movement on food safety, that doesn't mean those victories are safe, because at the White House, they figured out that they need to move decision-making out of Congress or out of a state legislature, put it in the White House, or put it overseas if they're going to control us. What can we do about this, or what can be done? I mean, the U.S. trade rules are now such that whatever we get coming back to Congress, I think we're going to have a really tough time impacting them. That means we've got to lean on Congress right now. We've got to be not afraid of this term protectionist. I loved hearing the stories this morning about being accused of being protectionist. You know, farmers are really accused of being protectionist all the time. And I just say, you goddamn right. This is a nation that we're trying to pass environmental rules and regulations and worker safety regulations and all the things that we need to have a better standard of living. And other countries are not passing those laws, and they're not going to pass those laws anytime soon. This idea that opening the borders to the free flow of trade is somehow free trade, when the rules on both sides of the borders are completely different, is lunacy. We need to protect our worker safety laws. We need to protect our environmental laws. We need to protect our standard of living. And that's right. It's not wrong. But farmers get accused of being protectionists, and there's lots of farm organizations, as they're called, who are not representing the interests of farmers, but are representing the interests of the agribusiness corporations and the others. And I'll pick up on an example that got raised earlier, just to give you an idea of this. President Bieber brought up about Japan opening its borders to more beef and citrus imports. And I have to say that a lot of the impetus in the United States for that kind of a drive didn't come from farmers who thought about it or from Cy Carpenter or other people. It came from the fast food restaurants in this country and the cereal manufacturers. Why? Well, why do they care about what happens in Japan? Well, it turns out that they know that the United States market in agriculture is very protected. We have very strict import quotas on beef and a lot of other things. They understood that if they could force Japan to open its market to more U.S. rice and beef, and might I add that they didn't open it to more U.S. rice and beef, they opened it to more rice and beef, and of course Australia is a hell of a lot closer to the United States, and so somebody else is getting the, quote, benefits of this. But if they could get Japan to open their market then they could come back to the United States and say, now look, Japan opened its market to more beef and citrus and rice, etc. Now we need to open our market here to be fair. And the minute Japan made that agreement, the fast food hamburger joints, the Kellogg's, and all the cereal companies began pounding on the U.S. government saying, hey, if Japan opened its market, we should be opening ours. And I tell you, the people in Central America who are fighting to protect their rainforest there, they know what that means. If the United States was an open market to beef, it means that the rainforests of Central America would be gone. You can cut down a rainforest and turn cattle loose and produce beef so cheap and flood our market so quickly that they know that if the United States doesn't limit the imports of beef, not only are their rainforests gone, but all the lands that they use to produce food for themselves. So we begin to see these sort of three-way strategies where we pound on other countries. And you know, there's some good Democrats and people who are thoughtful, but who support that kind of idea, but don't see how it's coming back. But one day I was talking to a group of farmers about this, American farmers, and they were being kind of sheepish. One organization, I won't mention any names, but they were telling me that a few years back they had gotten a big bunch of money from Nissan Corporation. A bunch of you are familiar with Nissan Corporation. Now, why were they funding a U.S. farm organization? Well, it turns out that Nissan wanted them to say publicly and very loud in the United States, we need to force Japan to buy more food from America's farmers because that'll balance out this trade imbalance that we face. Why did Nissan care? Yeah, they wanted cheaper food in Japan for their workers. All corporations want cheaper food for their workers, but that's not the main reason. Nissan knew that with this trade imbalance that the United States would someday wake up and say, look, we have to start buying less cars if we're going to put this trade imbalance back into order. And Nissan thought, and it turned out Honda and a bunch of the other ones, that if they could convince the American people that by selling Japan more rice and beef, and I'm talking like it might be $100 million a year, that then we would never wake up to the fact that the problem with the trade imbalance isn't that we need to sell more to Japan. We need to buy more cars built by United Auto Workers from this country to change this trade situation. We have to be more sophisticated. We can't be afraid to be called protectionist. Hell, I protect my family. That's my job. And we have to be more sophisticated when we talk about other people's trade laws. Trying to sell more whatever we produce overseas, we're not going to settle a $150 billion trade deficit. We got to buy less and buy more for our own people. But we're going to have to begin looking in a more sophisticated, in a more straightforward way, in a more courageous way to do that. And why do I think this is important right now at this moment in history? Because the whole economy is beginning to be adjusted because of this environmental question. I can remember 10 years ago, we were all talking about ethanol. You know, that's the sort of gasoline that we make out of corn, and the need to build an ethanol industry because, you know, someday we would run out of oil and the Arabs and all this kind of stuff. Well, it turns out in the last 10 years they keep uncovering more reserves of oil, but what we find out is that we will kill ourselves from burning petroleum and natural gas and coal a lot sooner than we'll run out of it. And so we're beginning to think all of a sudden, hey, we've got to shift our whole economy to new, less polluting, more environmentally safe. Now the corporations have figured this out. Where do renewable, non-polluting resources come from? They come from agriculture and forestry and from the seas. They come from carbohydrates, which are the building blocks of food, not from hydrocarbons, which are the building blocks of petroleum. And they've begun to look into the next century and say, hey, we have to shift our economy, especially the energy sector and the raw material sector, away from petroleum and coal and uranium and these other resources which are running out someday, but which are basically killing us in the way that we're using them. We're going to have to shift to products that are made from renewable resources like trees that grow back and corn that grows back and from the seas. And those corporations have figured out that they need to move on those natural resources right now. And the struggle in agriculture today isn't over efficiency and all of that kind of nonsense. It's over who's going to control the resources which will be the building blocks of the future economy. Right now we've got 7 sisters of oil companies who control basically the building blocks of our current economy: petroleum, coal. What they want to do is to try to enforce that kind of corporate control into the future. They want to control the genetics and the seeds all the way down so they can control those future resources. So the fight that family farmers are waging with the UAW's help and the help of a lot of other people is a fight over that future. It's over who's going to own and control those natural resources that will be the basis of our future economy. If a small number of corporations can get control of it, we know they will produce even those renewable resources with unrenewable practices, with more chemicals, with more fertilizers. If family farmers can hang on and ownership can stay dispersed, then we can make a transition backwards or forwards, depending on how you want to describe it, away from all these chemicals and poisons to the kind of high productivity and chemical-free production that we know is possible in other areas. Even the crisis that you are facing now in the struggle over the emission standards, as long as they can keep us burning gas rather than ethanol, we're going to continue having this fight. You know, we really lay on to Brazil about cutting down the rainforest, but we never say that they've converted most of their fleet in the nation, their public fleet and stuff, to ethanol, which doesn't pollute in the air. You know, we could shift our natural resource base so that we're using more and more corn and agriculture products in our fuel and make the adjustments in our air quality standards that way rather than offshore movement of our production and a lot of other fights we go in. So it's possible that our futures are tied together in the economic and political arena in the same ways that they're tied together in the environmental and the social arena as well. Now the question for us as we face this future where there's some change coming in the economy and in the environment and the question of who will control it, it becomes a question really about our nation's future. And will we recede into the past as other great nations have done, destroyed from the inside much more than destroyed from the outside? Or will we learn from the lessons of history so that we can in fact avoid the possible dismantling of ourselves as a great nation and give that kind of future? For me, it's not a sort of a mythological or somehow a dream kind of world where I'm concerned about. It's as practical as what's the kind of world that I'm going to leave my children? What kind of schools and housing and the air and the water? But I know that we're not the first to be thinking about this. In fact, I've always been very inspired in my life by President Roosevelt, who did a lot of thinking about other great nations and what happened to those great nations. I mean, he took the reins at a time where I think the survival of this nation was somewhat in question in terms of its future and what its position might be in the world. And he knew there were lots of factors to that, organized labor and the treatment of working people, lots of other things. But he also knew that the care and protection of the natural resources and the environment had something to do with the demise of other great nations throughout history. In fact, in the Department of Agriculture during that time, they decided that they had to find out more about this history. And they took one of their leading staff, Mr. Loudermilk, and remember, this is the middle of the Depression. There wasn't a lot of extra money around, but they sent him around the world to study great nations which had disappeared and the link to how they took care of their soil and water resources and what was the connection. And he went around the world, came back and wrote a little booklet that's sort of long since been lost, I think. But his conclusion, I think, is something that comes as no surprise, that nations that squandered their soil and water resources, like Rome did, in what I read earlier, eventually disappeared largely because of that. And as a result, he was able to articulate some of the concerns. And in an interview in 1939, somebody was asking him, well, what did you conclude? And he said he included that the Lord should have included an 11th Amendment. And he said it should go something like this: Thou shalt inherit the holy earth as a faithful steward, conserving its resources and productivity from generation to generation. Thou shalt safeguard thy fields from soil erosion, thy living waters from drying up, thy forests from desolation, and protect thy hills from overgrazing by thy herds, so that thy descendants may have abundance forever. If any shall fail in this stewardship of the land, thy fruitful fields shall become sterile, stony ground, and wasting gullies. And thy descendants shall decrease and live in poverty or perish from the face of the earth. My friends, brothers and sisters, this is still the same challenge. President Roosevelt looked backward into history to find out where we needed to go into the future to ensure that we stayed as a great nation. We're at that same kind of juncture today. We can learn from history, but we have to build and make this world ourselves. No one knows more than trade union members about the need to take it upon yourself to improve your situation and to wage a struggle. Earth Day 20 years ago, we had kind of a leap in our understanding of our individual responsibility. We came up with this slogan that's in front of you today. Think globally. Be concerned about people who are starving in Africa, situations of the environment. Think about what's going on around the world and do something about it at home, in our unions, our churches, and our neighborhoods. I would challenge you that 20 years down the road now, and I can't underline more the way President Bieber talked this morning about the fact that if you're polluting in Mexico, it's blowing across our border, or if you're making decisions in banks in London, it affects us. I would say that's exactly what we have to incorporate into our thinking today. That if we want to save family farmers here in the United States, if we want to protect our environment at home, if we want to protect our jobs and our worker right condition, if we want to think about our situation at home, we also have today to learn to act globally as well. If we want to help people in other countries, we have to do something at home. But if we want to protect and defend and improve our situation now, we must now learn to act globally. Very few organized groups in this country, other than labor and perhaps the churches, have any potential possibility of really acting globally. So again, that leadership, that responsibility falls on your shoulders, falling on the shoulders of the people who've always been there to pick up the leadership and who are carrying many other burdens as well. And I don't minimize that at all. But I have to plead with you now, as I understand our environmental situation and the situation of family farmers. We need to stand together united. We do need to know how an injury to one is an injury to all. But we need to learn to act in a global way, in a new way, in ways that we've never considered before, because only in acting globally in the future will we be able to protect the things closest to ourselves and our families that we've come to love and to cherish at home. Thank you very much.
Thank Mark very much.